are the best tabletop role-playing game systems independents. Tabletop role-playing games began with Dungeons & Dragons, which is now the most well-known and the most played role-playing game, but does this make it the best? Do indie tabletop role-playing game producers have the potential to make the next best paper and pencil role-playing game in the tabletop RPG industry? And will role players eventually move on from D&D?
Trapped in every corner, swaying sides of misery. Roll your dice if you dare, but don't come crying to me. Orcs are slaying elves, the greenskins don't know peace. Goblin heads on shelves, someone call the TMG.
Joining me today is Professor Dungeon Master. I am the DMG. Why are most indie RPGs just shelf fillers?
Well, I think that you got a lot of path dependency with Dungeons and Dragons. It is the most, it's iconic. It's got the most market penetration. However, just because something's on a shelf and not as many people play it doesn't mean it's not good. Because I remember the days back in the 80s when there were tons of role-playing games like there are now, but Dungeons and Dragons wasn't nearly as big as it is now. So many of the games, like Pathfinder does about the business that Dungeons and Dragons did back in 1988. So the whole market has grown. Even back in the day, I played like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is still available today. And I thought it was a great game. I still think it's a great game. So does that mean, it's because it doesn't sell as much as Dungeons and Dragons, does that mean it's not as good? I don't necessarily think so. It's sort of like with music, with popular music. I think David Bowie once said, he says, the Beatles sold a lot of records, but I think the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed are way more influential. Like if you ask bands who they like, it's always like Lou Reed. And Lou Reed was a guy that didn't sell a whole lot of records. He had like 2 top 40 records. Great ones, by the way, New York and Transformer. But, like everyone's got the White Album. And I just think that just because something is commercially ubiquitous doesn't mean it's necessarily the best or only that should exist.
Yeah, it's the same in things like films where the blockbusters are not necessarily the best films. They just happen to be the ones that have the most marketing dollars, have the most shelf space, have the most, like star attraction and so on and so forth. So I think that it's very important to kind of distinguish like between what an actual indie game is and how it is important, because yes, there are a lot of games that sit on shelves, and one of my favorite little ones that I've never played, right, is this one called Shadow, Sword and Spell. There's a lot of really, really cool ideas in there. I've never heard anybody ever talk about it or anything like that, but there's some great little bits of rules and things, and I think that's one of the things that you take away from a lot of these ones that sit on the shelves, is that they're great for mining ideas. And sometimes you don't want to play the whole game, but you just want to use one particular piece of it for your game. So, for instance, like luck dice that DM Scotty put out, right? That's a great concept that works in most games. You don't necessarily have to use it for D&D. You could use it in a range of games, as you have. I think that's part of the appeal of certain indie games, is not the fact that people are going to necessarily, everyone's got to play this game, is that they do influence games that do actually build upon that and actually do gain wider appeal. So as your sort of ICRPGs and EZD6s and those sort of really independent games take off, a lot of the sort of the inspiration behind those are even smaller games like Pocket Fantasy and things like that, which deserve more play, but may never get to the heights of a D&D, because I think they really are just something that becomes an ephemera of the moment. It's just something that someone felt they wanted to put out, but it didn't really have the community impetus behind it. I think that's what really caught on with D&D, because it was so new and it wasn't like anything that had ever come before. It kind of got that wellspring of fandom behind it that kind of pushed it to where it is today. And it didn't happen to the size that it is now, it didn't happen immediately. It did take 5 decades. It's not an overnight kind of thing. It did obviously was big in the 70s and the 80s, but nowhere, as you say, it's nowhere near as big as it is now.
It's about 5 times bigger by my calculations.
Yeah. So the top 3 indie RPGs that don't just sit on shelves, what do you think they are?
Well, if you consider Pathfinder an independent, you'd have to put that at the top. If you consider it, if we consider it's still a major corporation, Paizo. I think that from what I'm seeing, Old School Essentials, Shadow Dark have really exploded. That's what I say. Like and Call of Cthulhu, if you consider that an independent game. Call of Cthulhu dominates the horror market, but Old School Essentials and Shadow Dark have really exploded in a way that I'm very pleased and surprised.
Yeah, I mean that's the help of the internet. Really, is what's come to the fore there. Something like Shadow Dark, maybe without the internet would never have got to where it got in terms of its funding. Old School Essentials, in terms of people coming back to D&D and finding something they didn't like, and then wanted more of what it was, an expansion upon what it was. And I think that's what's kind of brought that back into the fore, is older gamers sort of returned to the market. Because it seems like there's always that gap where there's the initial uptick of a game, and then there's that sort of plateau period, and then it dips, and then someone discovers it, and it skyrockets again. That seems to be the way things happen. But some games obviously will always be the obscure one on the shelf, and some of them will obviously take off and be more mainstream. So when does a game become mainstream?
I don't know, because it's such a small niche hobby. So all right, Dungeon Crawl Classics, Goodman Games, which is a great game. And I go to Gen Con, they have a huge room where they're running Dungeon Crawl Classics. And it's a vibrant community. You can look on YouTube, Twitter, people talking about that game. And whenever I go into that room, I stop in that room, I see tons of people having fun. Now, is that mainstream? I don't know. It's mainstream, I think, for Gen Con. I see it at every convention. However, it's a very small, the role-playing games in general is a very small niche market, but I would consider that game, a mainstream hit. I Call of Cthulhu too. It really depends on how you gauge it. Do you gauge it based on, does the average person, the muggle out there, have they ever heard of it? Is that your measure of success, or does it sustain itself? Because when I go to conventions, I'll see games sustaining themselves. Like Goodman Games that booth is crazy. Like they're at Origins now. And I've seen pictures. Big booth, tons of people. At Gen Con, you can't even get near the booth. Like, you got to wait on a line just to get online. So they're doing gangbusters there. So within the gaming community, that's a big deal. Is it in the mainstream community? I don't know. But I think it's awesome because they have an awesome game. And I'm sitting on another game here, Fate of the Norns, Ragnarok, which is a Viking game. There's no dice. Instead, you use like these tokens, right? And so it's a diceless role-playing game. It's an outstanding Viking game. Like if you ask, hey, I want to play a really cool Viking game, this would be the one that I choose. I've played it, right? Yeah, they use rune tokens because the Vikings use runes. Now that game sustains itself. Like the creator is at Origins now. I see him at PAX. I see him at Gen Con. So these people are making a living, and if you can make a living in the game business, I think that's successful. And it's just also, it's cool. It's cool to make a game.
Yeah, so really there's three mainstreams. There's mainstream where the average person in the world, if you said the name of the game, they would have an idea of what it may be. And I think Dungeons and Dragons kind of meets that. If you say Dungeons and Dragons, people kind of know that it's a game. They may think that it's running around in a forest with floppy swords hitting one another. I think that's a popular perception of what it actually is, because they don't have the kind of exposure. But I think as mainstream media, in quotes, touches on it more, then people have more of an idea of what it is. And I think that's why there's so many more people coming into it now, because that sort of mainstream kind of little hole is, people are starting to pour in from that. And I think one of the roles that D&D has is to widen that hole, to get more people into the bucket of the TTRPG industry. So I think that's where the mainstream, to continue the metaphor, the mainstream of the water is coming through the D&D hole. And then the mainstream within the bucket is really then your DCCs and your Pathfinders and so on and so forth, which the outside world has no idea what they are. So if you were to say Pathfinder to someone, they'd think you're talking about a car or a thing on Mars. They don't it doesn't have that recognition of the brand of D&D. I think that's important to recognize. And then the third one, which you mentioned, is when a person's making a living from the actual game. Now, if you're making enough money to sustain yourself in the modern world from your game, your passion, and so on and so forth, then it's a going concern, and then it is mainstream. Now, whether you're published by a larger concern, so a Paizo or Wizards of the Coast or Fantasy Flight or any of those kind of companies, or whether you're doing it on your own, I think it's the spirit is really the thing we're talking about, is the spirit of the independent person who created the game first and then found a publisher, rather than a publisher came to them and said, we want to make this game, which I think is really the route that happens the most. Is most people will develop a thing and then find a publisher for it, or self-publish the game. And really that's what I want to start focusing on with this podcast, is to really look at the starting, how do you come up with the idea for the game? How do you actually break into the zeitgeist of just the bucket that we're in? How do you get Deathbringer in front of more people? How do you get Easy D6, 70 System, ICRPG, all these great games? How do you put them in front of the audience and the players, who are the audience? What are we doing wrong?
Well, I'm not sure we're doing anything wrong. Like, I think that I'm very happy with where Deathbringer's at right now. It's been in the drive-through RPG, been their top 20 for like a year, or like whenever I released, I was like a year ago. It's still there. It's Adamantine selling. It's one of their best sellers. It's so like how much bigger could it be? And if I wrote a full version, for those of you out there that don't know, I'm a full-time teacher, right? So and then I'm a full-time YouTuber, and I have another full-time job. So then after that, I get to design games, and there'll be eventually a full book version of Deathbringer, but that takes a lot of time. But you got to this is the way I'm looking at it, is like Shadow Dark did on Kickstarter, 1.6 million, and Knave, Ben Milton's Knave, I'm good friends with Ben Milton. He did like 600,000 on Kickstarter, and they've got an audience, both of those games, of like 10,000 people each. I mean, that's a lot. So I think that Deathbringer could eventually reach an audience of between those two games, and that would be big enough. I'm not sure I would ever want to have a game the size of even Pathfinder, because what you mentioned about about the mainstream, they don't necessarily know. My question is, do I want them to know? Like when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, right, in America in the 80s, Bon Jovi was a very popular band, right? And I hated their music. Now, if you're a Bon Jovi fan, I'll give you Wanted Dead or Alive. Like those guys can play their instruments, and that's a great song. But I didn't care for it. I like The Cure. The Cure was my band, and it was a bunch of goth weirdos that no, like and The Cure. I remember seeing them when they played Madison Square Garden for the first time. It was a big deal because it was like a breakthrough moment. And eventually, that band had top 10 hits in the U.S. But it was like a secret thing that not everybody knew about, and that's part of what makes it cool. Like if everybody's into it, then it's just like, So I would never want it to be that big. And I think that with ICRPG, it's a big game. I mean, I saw a picture of it in a library recently. With Easy D6, I think that game is driven by Scotty's personality, but it's out there. It's in the best-selling chart at our Drive Through RPG. So the question is like how what makes a game really super big over a long time is you need an ecosystem. You need a support system of people, not the creator, but other people designing stuff for it. But I don't know. My game doesn't have to be the biggest game for me to think it's successful. If Deathbringer is never bigger than it is now, that'd be all right.
I think people don't, when people get into things, they don't really define what they feel is success before they start the thing. And it doesn't apply just to RPGs, it applies to anything you do. Like if this is what I believe is successful for my business or for my week or for my game or whatever, like that's different from someone else's success. Never define your success by what something else is defined as successful. Because I can tell you that Hasbro has a different definition of success for D&D than we would have, and that probably is dollars based. If it's not making X number of dollars a year, we're not going to put more into its budget. Like that's when the bureaucrats get involved. And I think like that's where things start to get ruined, and that's when it stops being independent. All right, when the bureaucrats actually come in and ruin things, because they're not. You did a video on this that you put out about a week ago, I think it is, where you talked about the various stages, and D&D started as a sort of independent thing, and then it became a company, and then it became this thing. It was bought by Wizards, and then that was bought by Hasbro. And Hasbro's never made its own game; it's just bought games, and that's really, that gets to a point now where at the end of the D&D movie that just came out, they don't even mention Gygax and Arneson, which is a tragedy in and of itself. But I would argue half the people playing D&D today wouldn't even know who Dave Arneson is. Which is sad. But when you're building something, I think, where you say your measure of success is, I want my family to live on this for the next 2 or 3 generations, is a different level of success to, when I go to conventions, I'd like people to come up to me and shake my hand and say, thank you for changing my way of playing games. Like, to me, that's a huge level of success. Like, when I put out my game, it's like, if someone comes up to me and says, Gareth, thank you for putting that out. I enjoy using it. I don't play it every day. I wish I could play it every day, but I got a lot from it, and so on and so forth. To me, it hits you in the feels, and that's success for me, right? One can argue like it didn't make any money or blah 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 blah, but if you don't define your success by that, then you don't need to worry about that. But if you want to be the best-selling RPG on DriveThruRPG, you're going to be in for a shock. Because you need to know what it is that you're getting into in order to find that level of success and beyond, if that's what you do. So, what does WotC get wrong
about D&D?
Well,
you could make the argument they get nothing wrong because it's more popular than ever. I think what they get wrong about the game for me is it's made for, in my opinion, for a younger demographic. It's a power-based game. It's about optimizing the character, about having the most powerful character. having a character that you whatever you imagine, you can be a super powerful Thundercat, and you're multi-classed and you're optimized in every way. That creates a very short-term campaign, and it ultimately creates a short-term player, because the people that stick with role-playing games generally, in my experience, there was always the kids that that had to have that character. That was the super character. And they came and, oh, I rolled this character myself. I have 3 18s and a 17, 16, and I just noticed that those kids don't play anymore. The people that I play with are my friends, and I are the ones that died the most. And if you don't have a game where where the characters can die, there's really nothing at risk, and it becomes an ephemeral thing, and you get people. I think too that the interest in D&D, this is a perception, this is my perception, there's nothing backing this up,
Yeah.
but it may be the interest may be a mile wide and an inch deep, where people, I think there's a group of people that buy Dungeons Dragons merchandise that don't actually play the game. They watch it played on Twitch, but they don't play it themselves. And so I think that if that's the audience that Wizards of the Coast has, they have to constantly keep replacing it. And they're on the right track, because what they're doing is the reason they're doing this version of the game is not just they're leveraging the 50th anniversary with introducing a virtual tabletop, and they want to migrate this game to the virtual tabletop. They don't want it to be a tabletop anymore, because people in virtual land can pay $9.99 a month for the latest updated books and access to adventures and all these different supplements. That's where they're moving it. Now, if you like that, if a person likes that, great, then they're doing it right. If you like playing around a tabletop with human people, then that's the way I prefer to play. And I really don't care what the outside world does. I only care what my friends and I do.
I wrote my master's thesis on the universal structure of narrative, and I focused on televised sport, role-playing games, and computer games, and how the sort of a universal narrative structure moves through all three, and everything else, obviously. But the thing that I started to see early in the birth of sort of internet and connected games and audiences and things was that you look at StarCraft as an example, huge player base, and then it started to become a thing that people watched. It was really the first game where people actually watched games, computer games, on the internet. And obviously in South Korea, it became like a televised thing that it was on TV. And I think what's happening with D&D is becoming more of a sport, where you have fans that watch D&D streams that don't play the game. It's like people who watch soccer games but don't play soccer, right? There are kids that play soccer who go through and try to become soccer players, and then they get to real life and they stop playing soccer. And I think that's really what happens with D&D, is that real life kind of happens. That's why people disappear from D&D, and then they come back and then they go, well, it's changed now. Now it's all sort of Champions League, and and you've got all these people televising or whatever. I just want the simplicity of what I remember. That's kind of where I see it at the moment, is that it's actually moved into a different paradigm. It's transcended beyond just a game. It's become a sport. That's not something they're doing that's wrong. I think that's right in a way, because that does, as we talked about, the sort of the hole that people come through, it does widen that hole. So StarCraft got a lot more people interested in multiplayer computer games. Arguably there are a lot of other games that did as well, but in the sort of zeitgeist of human history, that's really the one that kind of drilled the biggest hole into the mainstream. And I think that's, as independent people, when you're creating a game, you kind of have to have that in your mind, because YouTube is the big thing that pushes most RPGs at the moment. I mean, you and I are in it. It's like Shadow Dark, if it didn't have the support of YouTubers who said, this is great, this thing, I don't think it would have done $1.6 million. I think it still would have done well because 30% of the people who backed it would have come just from Kickstarter alone who'd never heard of it. But then you got another 30% who would have gone and done a little bit of research about it and find a whole bunch of YouTube videos. So there's your next third. And then those people would have spoken, who heard about it from a YouTuber would have told their friends, shared on social media, and so on and so forth. So I think having a game where you appeal to an audience rather than actual gamers is one of the things that you can do to elevate a game more so than you would if you just if your level of success is I just want people to play the game. And I think that's where those sort of games do it right.
YouTube, because you mentioned YouTube being integral, it's integral to Shadow Dark's success, and that she wrote a very good game, and she did what WotC didn't do, which is she knew, first of all, Kelsey knows personally, like, Runehammer. She's his game master and stuff, and so she tapped into the circle of people that I know, like you, like Baron Durop at Dungeon Masterpiece, and Ben Milton at Questing Beasts, and Hanker Infernal, and we all started talking about that game. Whereas WotC probably doesn't know that I exist, and if they do, they probably don't like me very much. And but she was able to tap into that and leverage that. She was able to, that's the first game I think that really leveraged the power of YouTube.
Yep.
And took the independent, or maybe Dungeons of Drakkenheim by the Dungeon Dudes was a similar thing where they used their YouTube channel as a springboard to make a really cool game. That's another one. So,
and I think that's what's happening now with Critical Role, is
right.
They're trying to do that as well.
They are, and I would do the same thing if I were them. They have a bit of an advantage in one regard, in that they have a larger fan base. The disadvantage is they have a lot of people in their structure, and that's a lot of people to pay.
Yep.
To make a game and to mass produce the game. The numbers that they would have to do would have to be unbelievable.
Yep.
And I'm not sure their fan base there's a certain, I want to be careful not to incur the wrath of the critters, because I like the show and I like Matt Mercer and all those players. But I'm not, I think there's a segment that just watches Critical Role. And so it's difficult to judge, their success. It's going to, I couldn't predict it. The numbers that they have to do would have to be much bigger than Shadow Dark, assuming that even a fraction of their audience comes along for it. And I think that where games get it wrong, I think that with independent gamers, this is where they get it wrong. I think that what you have to do is you have to have a strong, you have to have a lot of experience with game design, right? So I started with writing a Dungeon magazine. I got several modules published there, and so did Chris Perkins. And Chris Perkins eventually, he became Chris Perkins over at Wizards of the Coast. That's how you cut your teeth. You design monsters, you design adventure modules, you learn how a system works. Then you build a reputation, then you release a game. You have that. Now with YouTube, it's, Deathbringer wasn't successful just because I was on YouTube. It was also, I knew how how Dungeons & Dragons works intimately. And then I had a good partnership with Hanker Infernal over there at Runehammer, who knew how to market it and make it look unique. So I think people rush into it. Like, you can't just create a game system and sell it. That's an uphill battle, because you're competing with a bunch of other game systems, and they don't necessarily know your work. Even Kelsey, with Shadow Dark, she designed 5e modules for the longest time until she was designing 5e stuff, until she had enough experience, enough of a reputation that she could put her own game out. So if anyone's watching this and thinking, I want to make a game, the first thing you should do is probably start with designing monsters. Then you design modules. And like Shadow Dark right now would be a fertile ground for doing that because she needs to grow that ecosystem. And I'm encouraging people. I say, if you want to design something, catch the wave. Design something for Shadow Dark. There's tons of people that'll be looking for material. And then you slowly, you get your skills together and then you put your own game out. That was a long, circuitous response, but that's what I think.
No, well, it's perfect. It perfectly sort of encapsulates how I feel about it as well. It's like you got to cut your teeth. You don't necessarily need to actually be putting out content that you sell, but you should definitely be getting your toes into and your feet wet in other games to figure out what they do right and what they do wrong, so that you begin to learn how it all gets put together and how it functions at the table. I think that's the key thing. Again, it's like a lot of people focus heavily on mechanics and, this percentage chance of success and whatever. And I think a lot of people don't really look at what's fun and what actually is the thing that makes the game sticky. Arguably, that's the most important mechanic of your game, is how sticky it is for the players. To me, the measure of success for my game is when someone says, I'd like to play another session of that, or I had fun. Like that, it doesn't matter. They don't talk about the rules. They don't talk about the story. They just said, I have fun and I'd like to play that again. To me, that is the ultimate success. Okay. And if you can get to that, right, then you have something that you can then put the rest of the effort behind. And I think what's important that you kind of focused on but didn't say is you need to have a collaborator. You need to have someone who can help you, who they don't necessarily need to be a big YouTuber. They don't necessarily need to be, well known, but it could be an artist. It could be a musician. It could be a business manager. It could be anybody who has a skill that you don't have, all right, or is better at a thing that you do or can't do, and you get that person to assist you to push it to where it needs to go. I think that's what a lot of people do wrong, is they get very precious about it being their thing, and they don't really want to let anybody else in, and then they don't realize that it's not fun, and they tinker with it too much, and they don't let it fly. And I think that's what they kind of do wrong. And the other thing that I think people do wrong is free. I don't like the concept of free. Free is a double-edged sword. Now, obviously, you sell Deathbringer, and originally it was a Patreon exclusive. Now, you could just put that out for free, right? Now, why would you start charging even 99 cents for it?
Because my time is worth money.
Correct.
And I believe it's good.
So, that, and I think that's people kind of see, oh, well, Gmail is free, and, Hotmail is free, and all these free-to-play games are free, and they kind of get, well, if you want to actually be played, it's got to be free. And that's a huge trap. The reason those things are free is because they make money in another way, or the product is something else. Like Facebook is free because you're the product. Your content that you put on Facebook is being sold to marketers to then sell ads to you and your friends. Really, that's how it becomes a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. But a lot of people, they just put their thing out for free because they think, more people will play it because it's free. That's not how it works.
Not at all.
Not at all. it's kind of like if you don't place value on a thing, why should the person purchasing it place value on the thing? And yes, you can do, the 99 cent to get the toe in the door, so, but I think arguably if no one would pay 99 cents for your game, why should it even be free? Because no one would want it when it's free anyway. Yes, a game, if it was $100, you would have far less. You might get one sale every 3 years or something, because it's $100, and that would have to be quite an influential person to kind of push that game at $100 price tag. So pricing is a very delicate subject, but free is a double-edged sword that I think people should really avoid doing.
Yeah, I want to say, because we're in total agreement, and I'm going to go back 2 points, which is if you want to design games, you have to play a lot of games. Like, so when I was a teenager, I'm like 19. I've been going to Gen Con since 19, 20 years old, and I played everything, even if I didn't know the system. Yeah, I'll sit in Pendragon, I'll sit in Elric or Stormbringer. I'll play Vampire the Masquerade and Paranoia, like every single game I could get my hands on. Because once you play enough games, you realize, okay, well, this is kind of like this game, but I can innovate and add a new mechanic and make it like raise the level of coolness. Like there are a lot of D6 dice pool systems. I love Easy D6 because the dice explode. Like that innovation was like, I'm not going to name the other games, but there are a lot of games that are similar. But like that one thing, it's like, wow, and many of the concepts of D&D that exist, and ICRPG and all those games, they take them from other games. Like I think a very influential game was James Bond 007 role-playing by Victory Games. It's one of those games that if you were alive in the 80s, you borrow, a lot of games today borrow ideas like the idea of hero points to succeed and stuff from that game. That was the first game that did that. When people ask me for advice on games, like with Patreon, I respond, well, it's like this game. Did you ever read this game? Because everything you think you've done has probably been done before, and it's succeeded or failed to some extent. You have to know what that is. Then in terms of a collaborator, you're absolutely right. Having collaborators, even before working with Runehammer, back with Dungeon Magazine, I had collaborators I published one of the adventures by myself, but I had co-writers for them. One of them, Christina Stiles, she writes for Goodman Games. She's written for Pathfinder stuff. And so it is important to have collaborators, and when you're new, you may only be able to get your friends, but you definitely have to have people to bounce ideas off of. And then as your games get traction, it will attract people. So like Hanker Infernal came to me and said, yo, Deathbringer's dope. I want to do it. I have a way to make it cool, with the fold out and so he approached me, right? So that's the kind of thing. And you approached me with Macbeth and stuff, which was a good collaboration in my opinion. And so people find each other; they'll gravitate toward each other. But yeah, free. It's not even a double-edged sword; it's a no-edged sword. It's like a spoon. Don't ever give away anything for free. And I have told that to patrons. They're like, I designed this thing. It's my first thing. I'm going to just give it away. And I'm like, no, you charge $2, not even 99 cents. You charge $1.99, because no one who would pay 99 cents won't pay $1.99. Never give away something, especially it's good. And I've seen some good stuff. Like my patrons, they've shown me things that it's professional level stuff. And I've encouraged them, go out there and, sell it, because then you get you get a reputation for quality, and more people will look at something if you charge money.
I did 8 years of retail sales. I've done business to business sales. I've done online sales. I've done a wide range of different sales things. And to me, discounting means you haven't actually given enough reason to buy. If
Yeah.
you got to say, I got to discount this down to 99 cents to sell it, you haven't given the people enough reason to buy it. And some people have looked at what Scotty and I did with the North Road, which obviously, you've got to do shameless plugs. But, that on its own, the book is $59.95 US. Now, that's expensive for a role-playing game module book. But arguably, you're actually getting 16 modules. So if you were to buy them individually, which you can, they're $7 each, you're going to spend a lot more money individually than you would have them all together. Now, if I were to put that onto Drive-Thru RPG, it would probably be the most expensive book on there. But it still sells. It still sells because it's niche, and people can see that we put the time and the effort into it. And I haven't got anyone who said to me, like, I want my money back because this is not worth what I spent. That's never happened. All right. And, if it were to happen, I would gladly give them their money back because it's like, I don't want to put something in your hand where you feel you got like ripped off for your money. Like I want the value that Scotty and I put into it. Right. And you should feel like it was worth what I spent. Right. And once you get to that sort of happy medium, that's when you're both going to have a success. The customer succeeds in terms of getting a thing that they really like and enjoy and are happy with, and you succeed in the fact that you actually got paid for all your effort. It's not a bestseller. It's not something where we sell hundreds of copies a week, right? We might sell 3 or 4 copies a month, right? But we didn't do a massive print run. We did a very small print run. I could have spent an extra $350 and printed double the amount of copies. But I would have spent more in storage for those extra 500s that would have taken many years to sell. And I'm left with the last 100 or so copies, that will still sell a few copies a week. So it can still continue selling for about another year, maybe a year and a half, unless someone does a review of it or whatever, and it gets a spike in sales, and then it sells out, and then it will only be a PDF. But the next one we bring out will do a little bit better, because all the people who purchased before, who liked what we did before, will want to see what we've done next, right? And then but you got to do it again. It's not like you can just rest on your laurels and the next one's going to outsell. You've got to put in the same amount of effort you put into the first one, into the second one, and arguably even more. So, I mean, that's really, I think, what people need to focus on is if you do have a success and you do put out a little module where you sell 20 copies, right? And that was your goal. I want to sell 20 copies and that's my level of success. Your next one, you should say, okay, I want the art to be better and I want to sell 50 copies of the next one, and build and build and build and build and build until, you are reaching what you define as your own level of success, because what tends to happen is if you put something out for free and you're like, I want to get 1,000 downloads, and you get 2 people to download it, and it's all that work and all that effort. And arguably, if you sold it for 99 cents, you probably would have sold more than you would have got free downloads. Because the businesses that are selling the thing also need to make money. So they're going to push the ones that actually sell and have a price tag, because they make their percentage from that. Free things cost them money, so they are less likely to push free. Anyway.
By the way, the North Road, if people out there don't have it, it's very good.
Thank you.
It's very good. It's one of those things that you look at it and you're like, this is so much better designed than that, than the mass-produced stuff. From down to the artistic choices like you made, where certain pages have coffee ring stains, but just I'll never forget the image of that wheel. Was the wheel powered by the goblins rolling down the hill? It's just so great. It's that is a great product.
Thank you.
I give it a positive review, and people should get the North Road.
Thank you.
And I'm about to review Scotty's Book of Quests.
Yes, that is phenomenal. Was not involved in that. Obviously, Scott and I are really close friends, and you know, um, but yeah, I was not involved in that. But it is really, really good. I've already got the hard and soft covers. I did a video for it, but I didn't release it. I'm going to redo a new video because it needs to be better. For Scotty, it needs to be better.
That's my it's going to be my first review, one of my first reviews, one of the first two for Independent Games Month. If not the first, the second, but I'm probably shooting it tomorrow.
And for those who don't know, Independent Games Month is July 2023, and hopefully every year there should be an Independent Games Month, and then 2 months, and then 3 months, and then 4 months, until it's like that's all there is.
We'll
All
see.
right.
It's tough to know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, also when we talk about Scotty, and years of experience, you need to recognize that Scotty's EZD6 system was not just he sat down one day and wrote out a system. He played games for 40 or 50 years. I've been in his basement. His basement is just like a games museum. It's just board games, role-playing games. It's fascinating. I stayed at his house for a week, and we were down there every day, and we only scratched the surface of what he's got there. So if you ever get invited to Scotty's house, go. But
yeah, one Gen Con I have to go. I have to stop by.
Yep, but he runs those games, so he doesn't just buy the games and read through them, which is what I generally do because I don't have a huge group of people that I can play with because most of my RPG friends are international, so I don't have a lot of local gaming friends. So I do everything virtually, but there's something that's lost in that, and you want that sort of touch and feel of a game, and that's what Scotty has with going to conventions and trialing things for years and years. Started his channel and then using the terrain and going to conventions and building up the rabble-rouser base, so that when he put a game out, it's like, this thing works. You can tell by reading it that this thing works.
Yeah, and that is a great game. I love the way it's written. It's fantastic. I use it as a reference for my own writing. I just love it.
And that was the collaboration with Runehammer. Now, originally, Scotty and I were talking about EZD6. And, with birth of my child and things like that, I didn't have the time to really focus on it. So we would talk in the background and we'd kick around ideas, and he was really struggling with the magic system in that. And I'd give him some ideas, and then he would go away. And, and I'm not going to say that, I was super influential in the making of EZD6 because that would really, take away the decades of experience of him actually doing it to get there. I maybe helped with a monster, but Runehammer really took it. And when we talked about the collaboration, that's what really sort of put the polish on it that made it what it is. The polish that it sort of needed to get to where it is now. So that's why those collaborations are important, is that you have people you can sort of trust to get you to where you need to go.
Absolutely.
Are indie RPGs the best?
In my opinion, they are the most innovative. That's where you get the most innovative. Because as you mentioned that previous video that I did, and for those of you that didn't see it, a product has in its lifespan, you have when people come up with the original product, then it explodes in popularity, then it gets bought by a major corporation, and that corporation becomes the curator. They're the ones that make sure that product is on shelves in stores and it becomes ubiquitous. That's what they do. And they branch out into other media. They make people aware that a name like Dungeons and Dragons exists. But they stop innovating. At that point, they're not going to innovate. Dungeons and Dragons will no longer innovate. Even something like Advantage and Disadvantage, that was very innovative. And they're not going to have that. Future editions of Dungeons and Dragons won't change. The scale with which the ability scores go, the way the spells work, nothing will change because they need to program it. That's what that's about. That's why they're going to create this evergreen system. So it won't be innovative. You know, an innovative idea that is in that game, in the Dungeon Masters section, is the idea of proficiency dice, right? Where you roll a d6 because you're good with swords, and you roll it with the 20-sided die. It's a very innovative idea, and they didn't take it because they were coming back from 4th edition, and they were afraid. That's too radical. That's too different. Now, Robert Schwab, who worked on the 5th edition, took that idea and built Shadow of the Demon Lord around it. You know, around that concept. It's a great concept. So that game is much more innovative than Dungeons and Dragons. It's a better game, you know, because of his, you know, influence and stuff like that. So the innovative ideas, like the most innovative ideas I see, like mind-blowing stuff that I've never seen before, comes from an independent creator, not a mass market game, which everything in that is about. Let's continue the success of this game. Let's follow this formula, you know, and the product should look a certain way. We're not going to change anything. So best, it depends on the game, but certainly the most innovative ideas come from independent games by far.
Thank you very much for coming on and having this chat with me on this first run through of Indie Gamer Jones. This podcast is brought to you by Quest Givers. questgivers.com, where you can get system-neutral modules, including the North Road, which we talked about, and, of course, our guests' modules, which is Professor Dungeon Master's Frankenstein and Macbeth, which are great modules, and other interesting and wild and wacky things you can try out, including DM Scotty's Luck Dice. I'd also like to thank Danny Valentine for creating the music for this podcast. His band Nefarious Creatures, you can look them up. The wonderful music that will warm the cockles of your heart. So thank you, Dan. Dan is the Professor Dungeon Master from Dungeon Craft YouTube channel. All the links to things we've been talking about will be in the show notes and down below in the description. Thank you very much. See you in the next one.
Every corner, swaying sides of misery. Roll your dice if you dare, but don't come crying to me. Orcs are slaying elves, the greenskins don't know peace. Goblin heads on shelves, someone call the tea.